My son threw water on my face just because I asked for bread. That was the moment I decided it was time to walk away. The dining room was cold, far too cold for a family gathering. The walls gleamed in their perfect white, the marble floors reflecting the gleaming light from crystal chandeliers. The table, polished and pristine, stretched longer than necessary, as if it were designed to intimidate rather than invite. There was no warmth here, only a display of wealth. Sterile, empty, and strangely silent. I sat at the far end, smaller than the room would allow, my hands folded neatly in my lap. The others barely noticed me. Edward, my son, sat at the head of the table, scrolling through his phone with that same distracted arrogance that I'd come to resent. Jazelle, his wife, sat beside him, her posture perfect, her smile always 1 degree too bright. Their 2 children, barely old enough to understand the meaning of manners, sat hunched over their own devices, oblivious to the world around them. Dinner was served, a bowl of kale and quinoa with pomegranate seeds, glistening with an overly sour dressing that looked as good as it tasted empty. There was no aroma, no richness to the meal, just a sterile green salad that belonged more in a magazine than in a home. I took a bite, trying to force a smile, but the bitter taste left me wanting something more, something real. I glanced around the table, searching for something familiar, something comforting. A basket of bread, perhaps, or a roll of warm butter to balance the coldness of the meal. But there was nothing, only silence. "Jazelle," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "The salad is lovely. But is there any bread?" The room seemed to freeze, the clinking of silverware coming to a sudden halt. Edward looked up, his face contorting as if I had just committed an unforgivable sin. "Bread?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Mom, for God's sake, look at this table. We're trying to eat healthy. Can't you just eat what's served for once?" I blinked, stunned by his tone. I had only asked for a simple piece of bread. Nothing extravagant, nothing unreasonable. But there it was, his anger, his frustration, aimed squarely at me. I hadn't realized asking for something as simple as bread could make me the enemy in my own son's home. You always have to make a scene, don't you? He continued, shaking his head, his irritation growing. "This isn't your house, Mom. Your rules don't apply here." Jazelle sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes as if my presence were nothing but a nuisance. "Edward, just let it go," she murmured, though I could see she didn't mean it. Her eyes flicked to me, cold and indifferent, as if I was an inconvenience they simply had to tolerate. The children, who had been whispering and giggling under their breath, suddenly stopped. Their eyes flicked over to me, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the words Edward had spoken, or the way I was treated like an unwanted guest at my own family's table. It was just bread. I wasn't asking for much. But in that moment, it became clear. My presence wasn't welcome. Then, without warning, Edward stood up, his chair scraping sharply against the floor. He grabbed his glass of ice water, his hand shaking with anger. "Maybe this will wake you up," he muttered, as he threw the water squarely in my face. The coldness stole my breath. Ice cubes clattered against the plate and the floor, and for a second, I could only sit there, stunned. I blinked rapidly, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The shock of it didn't sting as much as the humiliation did. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Not one person spoke. Jazelle froze, her lips parted but silent. The children went completely still, their faces pale as they realized the gravity of what had just occurred. Edward simply sat back down, muttering under his breath. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we're trying to have a nice family dinner." I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply placed my napkin carefully on the table and stood up. My sweater clung to my skin, cold and wet, but my back remained straight, and my head held high. As I walked out of the room, I could hear Edward's voice, faint and dismissive, calling to the children. Finally, some peace and quiet downstairs. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The sting of the water on my face was nothing compared to the deeper, burning humiliation I felt in that moment. But more than the sting of the water, it was the sting of realizing how little I meant to them, how easily they discarded me. just like the bread I had asked for. Stay tuned to see how this woman gets her revenge and reclaims everything she lost. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Barbara Whitmore hurried down the hallway, her nursing uniform slightly wrinkled from a long shift. She had just finished 12 hours on the cardiac floor. Her legs ached, her back throbbed, but she didn't mind. Not really. This was what she did, and she had done it for years. Barbara had always been a woman of strength, the kind who quietly carried the weight of the world on her shoulders without complaint. Her patients, their families, and even the doctors knew they could rely on her. But in the quiet moments between patients, in the solitude of her late-night shifts, she often thought of Edward, her only son, and the sacrifices she had made to give him the best life possible. When Edward was just a boy, her life had been full of laughter and warmth, despite the challenges. But when her husband, Thomas, passed away suddenly at the age of 42, everything changed. One moment, they were sitting on the porch, Thomas reading the paper, and the next, he was gasping for air, unable to breathe. Barbara had performed CPR on him right there, on their kitchen floor, but it wasn't enough. Thomas died in her arms, and her world shattered. At the time, Edward had been just 15 years old. He came home from baseball practice to find his father gone. In that instant, Barbara's world went from two parents with dreams and hopes for the future to one woman, suddenly alone, trying to figure out how to keep everything together. She had to be everything. Mother, father, provider. It wasn't easy. The hospital became her second home, and every extra shift she worked meant more money for Edward's future. There was no time for vacations, no time for herself. She sold her wedding ring, her most cherished possession, to cover the cost of Edward's private school tuition. There were nights when she didn't sleep, tending to patients and then coming home to make sure Edward was fed, that his homework was done, that his dreams were being nurtured. She even sacrificed her own health for him. Barbara remembered the night she collapsed at the hospital, too tired to even lift her head, yet still refused to take a break. She pushed through because that's what mothers do. They give and give, even when there's nothing left for themselves. Barbara's pride in Edward was unwavering. When he was accepted into a prestigious university on a full scholarship, she felt a surge of joy that eclipsed all the hardships. She had done it. She had given him everything, her youth, her energy, and every last ounce of love she had to offer. The day Edward left for college was bittersweet. Barbara stood at the door, a suitcase in his hand, his excitement palpable. She felt so proud, yet a deep ache settled in her chest. The empty nest. It was the start of a new chapter for both of them. As she hugged him tightly, she whispered, "Make me proud, Edward. Remember what we've sacrificed to get here." "I will, Mom. I promise," he replied, his eyes bright with excitement. His future was just beginning, and she knew he would go far. But as the years passed, Barbara began to feel the distance growing between them. The calls became less frequent, the texts fewer, and when Edward did visit, there was a subtle shift in his behavior. He was no longer the boy who'd run through the backyard barefoot, laughing as he called her from the porch. He was now a man, living his own life, with his own priorities. Barbara didn't mind, of course. He was supposed to grow up and become independent. But the more he changed, the more she realized just how much she had given up for him. She had worked tirelessly, sacrificed so much to ensure his success. But now, as an adult, Edward didn't seem to remember what she had done for him. He didn't seem to understand the sleepless nights, the missed moments, the sacrifices that had shaped his life. Instead, he married Jazelle, a woman who didn't seem to care much for her, and settled into a life of comfort. Their home in Neighborville was beautiful, but it was cold. The laughter was gone, replaced by the harsh sound of indifference. Edward had everything: money, success, a family. But he had forgotten the most important thing: the woman who had given everything to make his dreams come true. And so, as Barbara sat in that cold, sterile dining room, looking at the perfect table that was anything but warm, the contrast between her sacrifices and Edward's dismissive attitude became too much to bear. She had spent a lifetime building his future. And yet, here she was, thrown aside like a forgotten piece of furniture. Her hands trembled as she stared at her plate. The weight of her sacrifices, the years of giving and giving until there was nothing left for herself, seemed to press down on her chest. She had done everything for him, and yet this was how he repaid her, by throwing water in her face at the dinner table. Edward had changed. But Barbara, she was still the woman who had raised him, the woman who had sacrificed everything, and though she hadn't realized it yet, the moment she had walked out of that dining room was the moment she began to reclaim what she had lost along the way. Barbara had imagined her later years differently. She had dreamed of a quiet, peaceful retirement where she could finally rest after decades of hard work. Her own little corner of the world, where she could sit back, relax, and savor the fruits of all the sacrifices she had made for Edward. When Edward and Jazelle came to her with the offer, she was filled with a mix of hope and relief. They were moving to a beautiful new house in Naperville, and they wanted her to join them. They promised her a comfortable mother-in-law suite, a place where she could live out her retirement without the worries that had plagued her for years. Barbara had expected a cozy space, a warm, welcoming room filled with sunlight, perhaps even a view of the garden where she could watch the seasons change. Instead, as she stepped through the front door of the new house, a deep sense of discomfort settled over her. The house was beautiful, an architectural marvel with gleaming marble floors, stainless steel appliances, and vast rooms that echoed with emptiness. It was the kind of house that looked more like a showpiece than a home. "Mom, over here." Edward called from the staircase, a wide grin plastered on his face. His excitement only made Barbara's unease grow. She followed him down the long hallway, her footsteps muffled against the glossy floors. Jazelle, with her usual disinterested smile, waved from the living room, her perfect posture a stark contrast to Barbara's growing discomfort. "Your room is just down here," Edward said, leading her down to the basement level. Barbara's heart sank as they reached the door. This couldn't be right. The mother-in-law suite was supposed to be a welcoming private space. But as the door creaked open, Barbara's hopes were dashed. The room was small, barely big enough for a bed and a dresser. The walls were painted a dull, lifeless gray, and a single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a cold, harsh glow over everything. There were no windows, no warmth, no comfort. The concrete floor was bare, and the air felt damp and stale, as if it hadn't been aired out in months. This was not the cozy retreat she had imagined. Edward smiled proudly, clearly oblivious to Barbara's disappointment. "It's cozy, right? You'll love it. You won't have to worry about stairs, and it's all set up just for you." Barbara nodded, but her smile felt tight, forced. The room was so far from what she had envisioned, and yet she didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want to seem ungrateful, especially after everything Edward had promised. But the truth was undeniable. The room felt like a storage unit, not a sanctuary. She walked around, her fingers brushing against the cold, bare walls. Her heart ached as she realized how far her life had fallen from what she had imagined. This wasn't her home. It was a place to be tolerated, a place where she was meant to exist, in the shadows of Edward's perfect life. "It's perfect," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, trying to convince herself as much as him. But the words felt hollow. Later that evening, Barbara sat at the small desk in the corner, sorting through the papers she had brought from her old home. It was then that Edward came in, his expression casual, almost dismissive. "So, Mom," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed and flipping through his phone, "I was thinking it might be a good idea for you to let me handle your finances from now on. You've worked hard, but you're getting older, and I'm sure you'd appreciate it if I could take care of everything." Barbara looked up from the papers, startled. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice faltering slightly. "Just that it's easier this way," Edward continued, not looking up from his phone. "You've worked your whole life. Let me manage your retirement, handle your bills. Trust me, Mom, I've got it all under control." Barbara's chest tightened. "I've always managed my own finances," she replied, her tone more defensive than she intended. Edward glanced up, his expression soft but condescending. "Mom, it's not about that. I'm just trying to help. You don't need to worry about it anymore. I can take care of it for you." It wasn't the first time he had said something like this, but this time the words hit harder. "Trust me," he had said. But the more Barbara heard it, the more it sounded like a command rather than a request. She knew what it meant. Giving him control. And that felt like giving up the last bit of her independence. But she didn't argue. She never did. Edward had always been the one who knew what was best, or so he believed. The truth was, Barbara had spent years building her own life, working hard, saving every penny, and now Edward was asking her to let go of it all. That night, as she lay in the cold, unfamiliar room, the silence felt deafening. The walls, bare and unwelcoming, seemed to close in around her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had become a guest in her own life, a life she had worked so hard to build. She felt small, insignificant, lost in the shadows of a house that was supposed to be her refuge. But the sense of betrayal ran deeper than the cold room. It was the way Edward treated her, like an afterthought, like a problem to be managed, not a person to be respected. The very son she had given everything for, who she had raised with love and sacrifice, was now dismissing her with every word and action. Barbara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of her emotions settling over her. She loved Edward, of course she did. But this was not love. This was control. This was disrespect. And it was becoming harder to ignore. The first few weeks in Edward and Jazelle's house were quiet. At least Barbara tried to make them so. She kept to herself, cleaned the house, and made sure the children were fed, as she always had. But the silence in the house, the polite smiles that were never quite genuine, grew heavier with every passing day. Slowly, without her realizing, the small, almost imperceptible hum of humiliation began to creep into her life, like a shadow that followed her from room to room. It started with little things, the way Edward spoke to her. The first time it happened, she brushed it off, telling herself it was just a misunderstanding. But as the days wore on, she couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just the dismissive tone he used when he spoke to her. It was the way he treated her, as though her very presence was a burden. It was the heat bill that first made Barbara uncomfortable. One chilly evening, as Barbara reached for the thermostat to turn up the heat, Edward was right behind her, his voice sharp. "Mom, what are you doing?" he snapped. "The heating bill is already high. Just put on another sweater." Barbara froze, her hand still hovering over the thermostat. "It's cold, Edward." "I was just trying to—" "I know what you were trying to do," he cut her off, his words dripping with impatience. "You can't keep raising the bills like this. I thought you'd be more mindful. We're not running a hotel here." Her chest tightened as he walked away, leaving her standing there with the cold creeping in, the warmth she'd hoped to feel slipping away as quickly as the words he had thrown at her. Not a hotel, as if she were a guest, an inconvenience. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat, but it stuck, lodged in the pit of her stomach, making it harder to breathe. Then came the medication. Barbara had been on blood pressure medication for years, and every month she made sure to refill her prescription. She'd never asked for anything special, always quietly managing her health on her own. But one day, while she was sorting through her medications in the kitchen, Jazelle glanced over and frowned. "Brand name again?" Jazelle asked, her voice laced with judgment. "Can't you ask your doctor for the generic version? The brand name is so much more expensive." Barbara blinked, taken aback. She hadn't expected to be questioned about something so personal. The medication wasn't even that expensive, but the way Jazelle spoke made it seem like she was being reckless with money. I've been on this one for years," Barbara replied, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "It works better for me." "Well," Jazelle sniffed, her tone dismissive, "if you're on a budget, you should be more careful. You don't want to waste money on something you don't need." Barbara felt her face flush, the words stinging more than they should have. She had never been the type to splurge unnecessarily. She had spent her life pinching pennies, saving every dollar, and now, this young woman, who she had done so much for, was telling her to be more careful with her own health. The humiliation continued in small bursts like this. It was in the way they spoke to her about everything. Her food choices, her spending habits, even the way she folded the laundry. She had once been the pillar of her own household, strong and capable, but now, in her son's house, she felt like a relic. An afterthought, a guest who overstayed her welcome. It wasn't just the words, though. It was the subtle looks, the quiet sighs, the way Edward would roll his eyes when she asked for something as simple as a glass of water, the way Jazelle would give her that thin plastic smile when Barbara tried to engage in a conversation. It was the way the children, who had once looked up to her as a loving grandmother, now barely acknowledged her presence unless it was to ask for something. Barbara tried to dismiss it all, to tell herself it was just a phase. But it wore her down, piece by piece. She began to feel like a shadow in their lives, always present, but never truly seen. Then, one evening, it happened. The moment that shattered everything, the water-throwing incident. It was dinner as usual, silent, sterile, and uncomfortable. The same bowl of quinoa salad sat in front of her, the same empty tension filling the room. Barbara had tried to make small talk, but no one was listening. She glanced down at her plate, her mind drifting back to memories of warmer, more genuine dinners from years ago, when Edward was still young, when their family had laughter and love. "Edward, can we talk for a second?" Barbara asked quietly, trying to break through the silence. He looked up, clearly irritated. "Not now, Mom. We're eating. I wanted to say that. Why don't you just eat what's in front of you like everyone else?" He interrupted, his voice sharp, his patience gone. Barbara swallowed the bitter taste in her mouth. She wasn't asking for much, just a conversation, just a moment of connection. But the more she tried to reach out, the more Edward pulled away, as though her presence was an inconvenience. Before she could respond, Edward grabbed his glass of water and, in one swift motion, threw it across the table. The cold water splashed across her chest, drenching her sweater, her hands, and the plate in front of her. The room fell into a stunned silence. The sound of the water hitting her skin rang in her ears like a slap. Barbara sat frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the wetness soaking through her clothes, the coldness creeping into her bones. But the humiliation, oh, the humiliation, was far worse. Edward didn't even seem to care. He simply sat back in his chair, exhaling with an air of finality. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we're trying to have a nice family dinner." The room remained still, except for the faint sound of Jazelle sighing, the children awkwardly glancing at each other. No one said a word. No one even apologized. Barbara didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply stood up, her back straight, her hands trembling, and walked out of the room. The coldness of the water was nothing compared to the sting of what had just happened, the sting of being treated as less than human by the very son she had given everything for. As she walked away, the echo of Edward's voice, distant, uncaring, hung in the air. Finally, some peace and quiet downstairs. Barbara didn't respond. She didn't have to. She had already begun to realize that she was no longer welcome, that the life she had built for her son, the sacrifices she had made, meant nothing anymore. Barbara sat alone in the small, cold basement room, the silence pressing in on her like a weight. The events of the evening replayed in her mind, each moment sharper than the last. The water, the coldness of it, splashing against her chest, soaking her clothes, her dignity. It had been the breaking point, the moment she couldn't ignore anymore. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just walked away, her mind a whirl of emotions she couldn't yet make sense of. But now, as she sat in the dim light of her basement room, the full weight of what had happened settled in her bones. The betrayal, the humiliation, the realization that her son, her only son, the boy she had given everything for, had treated her like nothing more than an unwanted guest, a nuisance to be discarded. Barbara's gaze flicked over to the corner of the room where a small suitcase sat, half packed with clothes she had carefully folded just hours before. She had been getting ready for bed when it happened, when Edward threw the water in her face, with that cold, dismissive look. And now everything was clear. She wasn't just a guest in their house. She wasn't even a member of their family anymore. She had been erased, left to sit in the corner while they went on with their perfect lives. She thought back to the years when Edward was just a boy. When she had been his world, his comfort, his protector. When he ran to her after school with scraped knees, and when he needed help with his homework, she stayed up late, patiently teaching him. She had been the one who helped him believe in himself, who taught him that love and hard work were all he needed to get through life. She had sacrificed everything for him. She had given up her career, her health, her future, all to build a life for Edward that he could be proud of. She had sold her wedding ring to pay for his education. She had worked double shifts, sometimes leaving the hospital so late that she would only catch a few hours of sleep before doing it all again. She had poured everything into raising him right, to make sure he had every opportunity, every advantage. She had done it out of love, and love alone. But now, sitting in this sterile, lifeless room, she couldn't help but wonder. Was it worth it? Did he even remember what she had done for him? The sound of her own breath, slow and steady, filled the room as Barbara looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the dresser. The woman staring back at her seemed so small, so insignificant. She didn't recognize herself. But deep down, she knew she was more than this, more than a woman who had been silenced, who had been made to feel invisible. She had spent so many years being the caretaker, the one who gave everything and never asked for anything in return. But now that part of her was dying, and what replaced it was something stronger, something quieter, something that would no longer accept disrespect. Barbara placed her hands in her lap, her fingers curling into tight fists. She had spent too many years being taken for granted, too many years ignoring her own needs while everyone else's came first. She had spent too many years being the woman who smiled through the pain, who kept giving, even when there was nothing left to give. But now, she was done. The years of quiet rage and sacrifice had come to a head. It was time to take back control. She was done being the victim. She was done being invisible. No one, not even her son, would ever treat her like that again. The decision came swiftly, like a gust of wind that swept away all doubts. Barbara would leave. She would reclaim her life, her power, and her self-worth. The moment had come for her to walk away and never look back. No more second-guessing, no more silence. The water that had splashed across her face was no longer just a symbol of disrespect. It was the spark that ignited something deep within her. It was the final push she needed to stop playing the role of the martyr and start living for herself. Barbara stood up, her spine straightening as she walked toward the dresser. She pulled out the box of important papers, the life she had built, the savings she had worked so hard to accumulate. All the things Edward had no idea about, the things he took for granted. She would not let him have them anymore. They were hers, and they always had been. She took a deep breath, a sense of calm washing over her. The rage was there, simmering beneath the surface. But there was also something else, something more. Powerful, peace, clarity, the resolve to never allow herself to be treated like this again. Have you ever had to reclaim your life after being taken for granted? She whispered to herself, the words slipping from her lips like a prayer. Barbara knew the answer now. She was done being taken for granted, and she wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Edward, stand in her way anymore. Barbara sat quietly at the small desk in the corner of her basement room, the morning light casting faint shadows across the concrete walls. The house above her, so beautiful, so pristine, felt like a distant memory now. She was no longer a part of it, not in any meaningful way, not after the way Edward had treated her. The silence in the room was heavy, but it was also calming, the calm before the storm. She had spent the last few days in a state of quiet determination, making plans in the privacy of her room where no one could find her. She was meticulous, methodical, and precise. It was how she had always operated, especially in the years she had spent as a nurse. During her time on the cardiac floor, She had learned to handle chaos with a calm hand. No matter how frantic the situation, she was the steady presence in the room. She had kept her cool when patients crashed and families panicked, when everything seemed on the verge of falling apart. Now, in the quiet of her basement room, Barbara found that same sense of calm creeping into her bones as she prepared for the next steps. She had always been capable of managing in crisis, and this was no different. It wasn't the storm that would rattle her, it was the aftermath. The cleanup. The final reckoning. Barbara pulled out a folder from the drawer, the contents neatly arranged. Legal documents, her investment portfolio, her savings accounts. She had spent hours gathering everything, cross-referencing her financial statements, and making sure she knew exactly what she had. It wasn't much compared to the wealth Edward and Jazelle had built for themselves, but it was hers. Every dollar, every cent. And now, she was going to make sure it stayed that way. She'd always been careful with her money. Even when Edward was younger, and they lived on a tight budget, Barbara had found a way to make ends meet. She knew how to save, how to plan, how to stretch a dollar. She had worked hard for what little she had, and now, she wasn't about to let anyone, least of all her son, take it from her. As she flipped through the papers, her thoughts drifted back to the day Edward had asked her to trust him with her finances. It hadn't seemed like a big deal at the time. After all, she was getting older, and the idea of someone handling her bills and investments seemed like a relief. She had been too trusting, too eager to please. She had been too focused on the hope of being cared for, instead of the reality of what was happening. But no more. This time, Barbara would take control. She wasn't going to let Edward make decisions for her, not when he had already shown her just how little he cared. No more sitting in the background. No more pretending to be the obedient, silent mother who was grateful for a roof over her head. She was done with that role. A sense of resolve washed over her as she picked up her phone and dialed the number of her lawyer, a man named Thomas who had helped her years ago when she sold her home to help Edward with the down payment for his house. "Hello, Thomas. It's Barbara Whitmore," she said, her voice steady. "I need your help with something important." Thomas's voice came through the line, calm and reassuring. "Of course, Barbara. What can I do for you?" "I need to make sure my finances are secure," she replied. "I need to know what my options are for protecting my assets." As the conversation unfolded, Barbara listened carefully, asking the right questions, taking note of the steps she needed to take. She made arrangements to meet him the following day, her mind already working through the plan. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be painless, but it was necessary. She had sacrificed too much of herself for Edward, and now it was time for her to take back what was hers. She wasn't going to let him control her any longer. The contrast between her life now and the woman she had once been, calm under pressure, always prepared, was stark. But in that moment, sitting at her desk with the papers spread out before her, Barbara knew one thing for sure. The woman who had raised Edward, who had built a life for him with nothing but hard work and sacrifice, was not going to let herself be pushed aside any longer. Her hands shook slightly as she tucked the documents back into the folder, but her mind was clear. The plan was in motion. Edward wouldn't have control of her anymore. Barbara stood up from the desk, her resolve hardening like steel. She was done being treated like an afterthought. The time for silence, for compromise was over. Now it was time to fight for herself. The morning sun filtered through the small basement window, casting a faint glow on the papers scattered across Barbara's desk. She sat there, her fingers tracing the edges of the documents, each one representing another step toward reclaiming her life. The air around her was still, yet there was a quiet energy that hummed beneath the surface, a feeling that the moment of change was finally here. Barbara had spent the last few days meticulously preparing. She had gathered her financial statements, reviewed the portfolio, and carefully examined every detail of her accounts. She had made the decision to take back control, and now she was ready to act. Edward had taken too much from her, both emotionally and financially. It was time to undo the damage, to take back what was hers. And not just her money, but her dignity, her independence, her peace. The first step was to move her savings. Barbara had worked for every penny, every cent. She had earned it through years of sacrifice and labor, yet she had allowed Edward to manipulate her into putting their finances together. No more. With a steady hand, Barbara transferred the bulk of her savings into an account under her sole name, careful not to leave any trace for Edward to find. The funds weren't enough to make her a wealthy woman, but they were enough to give her the freedom to make her own decisions, to live without fear of being controlled. Once the transfer was complete, she moved on to the next task, removing her name from the joint account. That account, which had once seemed like a simple way to manage their finances together, was now a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The moment Barbara had signed those papers, she had put her trust in Edward, believing that he would respect her sacrifices and care for her in her later years. But trust, as she had learned the hard way, was a fragile thing. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked through the online banking system. She felt the weight of every decision she had made for Edward, the sacrifices she had made for him, rushing back, but this time, there was no room for hesitation. She clicked remove name from the account, and just like that, the financial link that had bound her to Edward for so long was severed. Barbara stared at the screen for a moment, the finality of her actions sinking in. It was done. She had taken back control, but that wasn't enough. She needed to ensure that Edward couldn't touch her assets again. She needed to protect herself fully. Barbara stood up from her desk, her mind clear and focused. It was time to see Thomas, her lawyer, to finalize everything. Barbara's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as she left the basement and made her way out of the house. It was a quiet walk, one filled with the soft rustle of the leaves outside and the rhythmic sound of her heels against the pavement. But beneath the calm, there was a growing sense of empowerment that was impossible to ignore. Every step she took felt deliberate, like she was walking toward a new version of herself. Thomas's office was just a few blocks away, tucked between two tall buildings in the heart of the city. When she entered, the scent of leather-bound books and freshly printed paper filled the air. Thomas greeted her warmly, his professional demeanor a stark contrast to the quiet determination that had taken root inside her. "Barbara, it's good to see you," he said, ushering her into the office. "What can I help you with today?" Barbara took a deep breath. She had been in this office before, years ago, when she had sold her house to help Edward. But this time, the stakes were different. This time, she wasn't asking for permission or for advice on how to make things work. This time, she was here to protect herself. "I need to remove Edward's name from my accounts," she said, her voice steady. "I need to ensure my assets are secure." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? This is a big move, Barbara. Once you take this step, there's no going back." Barbara nodded. "I'm sure." Thomas didn't argue. He simply nodded and began to pull the necessary documents from his desk. As he worked, Barbara looked out the window, her mind racing with the implications of everything that had led her here. She thought back to the early days when Edward was a child, when she had done everything for him. She had sacrificed so much, hoping that one day he would see the value of her efforts. But now it wasn't about Edward anymore. It was about her. It was about reclaiming her life, her strength, and her self-respect. When Thomas handed her the final document to sign, she didn't hesitate. She signed with confidence, her signature sharp and clear, a symbol of the power she was beginning to take back. "Everything is set," Thomas said, looking over the papers one last time. "Your assets are protected. Edward won't have access to any of this." Barbara felt a sense of relief wash over her, but it was more than just relief. It was empowerment. She had made the decision to take control of her life, and now the pieces were falling into place. As she left the office, the city felt different. The sun shone brighter, the air felt cleaner. She had done it. She had taken the first steps toward her new life, one where she was in control, where she wasn't at the mercy of anyone, not even her own son. If you've ever had to reclaim your life after being taken for granted, or made a tough decision to take back control, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever fought to put yourself first. Barbara sat at the small oak table in her basement room, the soft light of the afternoon filtering through the window. Her hands rested on the papers in front of her, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the documents. Every page, every signature, represented the final steps of a journey she had been forced to take. A journey that had begun with love and sacrifice but had led her to the quiet, determined decision to take back what was rightfully hers. She had spent so many years building Edward's life, pouring everything she had into him, believing that someday he would appreciate her sacrifices. But instead of gratitude, she had been met with dismissal and disrespect, until finally, the tipping point had arrived. The water-throwing incident had been the catalyst, but it was not the final act. That moment had simply made her realize what had been clear for far too long. She could no longer remain invisible in her own son's life. Barbara knew what she had to do now. It wasn't about getting revenge. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her independence, her right to live her life on her own terms. Edward had taken so much from her already: her time, her energy, her love, and now, her financial security. But he would take no more. It was time for Barbara to stop giving, to stop sacrificing, to stop being the obedient mother who always put others first. With quiet determination, she opened the folder of legal documents in front of her. This was it, the final step, the last piece of the puzzle. Her fingers moved over the paperwork, papers that would sever the ties between her and Edward once and for all. She had already transferred her savings, removed her name from the joint accounts, and made sure every penny was secured in an account under her sole name. Now it was time for the final piece, canceling Edward's access to her money entirely. She picked up the phone, her heart steady, her mind clear. The call to the bank was brief, but significant. She calmly instructed the representative to cancel all joint accounts and remove Edward's access to her funds. It was done. A sense of relief washed over Barbara, but it was more than just relief. It was the satisfaction of taking back control. The satisfaction of knowing that no matter what happened next, she would not be at the mercy of Edward's indifference anymore. She had taken back her power, her security, and her right to live independently. Barbara placed the phone down, feeling the weight of the decision settle into her bones. There was no going back now. But for the first time in years, Barbara felt truly free. Free from the expectations that had been placed on her. Free from the silent sacrifices she had made for Edward, never once asking for anything in return. As she sat there, the realization hit her with a quiet intensity. She was leaving, for good. She had planned it all carefully, step by step. She had arranged for her belongings to be packed and sent to a small apartment in Sarasota, where she would start over. The idea of leaving Edward and Jazelle behind, of walking away from the life she had tried so hard to build for her son, didn't fill her with guilt or regret. It filled her with a sense of power. The realization that her happiness was no longer tied to them, to their approval, to their control over her. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the final piece of the puzzle, the letter she would leave behind. She had always been a woman of few words, preferring actions to speak louder than anything she could say. But this letter would be different. It would be her final statement, her declaration of independence. She scribbled down a few lines, the words coming easily now. No more explaining, no more justifying, just the truth. Edward, you threw water in my face because I asked for a piece of bread. You thought I was asking for too much. Well, I wasn't. And now, I'm taking back what's mine. You don't want to share a piece of bread? Fine, I'll take back the whole bakery. Barbara paused, her hand hovering over the paper. The words felt powerful, but they weren't words of anger. They were words of freedom. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. A final gesture to a relationship that had become one-sided and toxic. It was time to leave. She stood up, her movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. This was it. She wasn't going back. Not to the basement, not to the cold, sterile house she had once called home. She was leaving for good. Her suitcase stood by the door, already packed. She had already taken what she needed, nothing more, nothing less. It wasn't about the material things anymore. It was about reclaiming her life, her space, her peace. Barbara walked out of the room, her head held high, her heart steady. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The past was behind her now. The future was all hers. As she stepped out the door, she couldn't help but smile, just a little. Edward thought he had the power. He thought he could control her, but now he would understand just how wrong he had been. Barbara Whitmore was no longer a woman defined by sacrifice. She was a woman defined by strength, by independence, by the courage to walk away from everything she had built to find herself again. The house was quiet, too quiet. Edward sat at the kitchen counter, his phone pressed to his ear as he scrolled absent-mindedly through the emails on his laptop. Jazelle was in the living room, flipping through a magazine, though her mind was clearly elsewhere. The tension between them had been growing for weeks, but neither of them had bothered to acknowledge. It wasn't until the first call from the bank came in that the quiet in the house finally broke. Edward's phone buzzed as the screen flashed with the name of his bank's customer service line. He answered quickly, annoyed at the interruption. "Edward Whitmore," he said, his voice tight. "What is it?" "Mr. Whitmore, I'm calling to notify you of an issue with your account. There's no available balance on your joint investment portfolio. Your account has been frozen." Edward blinked in disbelief, sitting up straighter. "What do you mean?" "That account is fine." The voice on the other end was calm, but there was a slight edge to it. "I'm afraid there's been an issue. We've been instructed to freeze the account, effective immediately. There's no further access to the funds at this time. You'll need to contact your account holder to resolve this." "Account holder?" Edward's heart began to race. "What are you talking about?" "I'm the primary holder. The account is mine." The representative's tone remained neutral. "The primary account holder listed is Barbara Whitmore." Barbara. The word hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He felt his pulse quicken, his mind racing as the realization set in. He stared at his phone, momentarily frozen. Barbara had taken everything. The funds, the control, the house, the money that had kept them afloat. Gone. "Listen," he said, his voice suddenly cold. "This is a mistake. I need to speak to someone higher up. Get me a manager now." The representative didn't argue. "I'll transfer you now." Edward's hand shook as he dropped the phone to his lap. His mind was reeling. Barbara had left. She had taken the money and left him with nothing. His whole life had been built around that account. He had depended on it, used it without a second thought, assuming that it would always be there, that Barbara would always be there. But now, as the words sank in, he realized he had taken her for granted, underestimated her quiet resolve. The bank manager's voice came through the phone, but Edward barely heard a word. His thoughts were racing faster than he could keep up with. When the call finally ended, he sat there in stunned silence for a long time, the weight of his realization pressing down on him. Jazelle appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. "What's going on?" she asked, sensing something was off. Edward didn't answer immediately. His hands gripped the edge of the table, and he let out a sharp breath. "Barbara's taken everything," Jazelle's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "The bank froze our account. It's all gone. She moved her money, removed me from the joint account. All of it gone. She left us." Jazelle stepped back, her face blanching as the gravity of the situation hit her. "She what?" she gasped. "How could she? I don't know. But she's gone. She took everything we had. I thought she was just a quiet old woman who wouldn't make waves, but this is something else." The reality of it all was starting to set in. Edward's mind began to race, his thoughts spiraling out of control. The house, beautiful, pristine, the centerpiece of their success, was now a fragile house of cards. Without Barbara's money, the payments would stop. The bills would pile up. Their lifestyle, the one they had taken for granted, would crumble. Edward stood up, the chair scraping against the floor as he stormed toward the door. Jazelle followed him, her expression a mix of disbelief and frustration. "We have to fix this," Jazelle said, her voice tight. "We can't just let this happen." Edward clenched his fists, his face contorted in anger. "What do you think I'm doing?" "I'm going to find her. I'll make her fix this." "You don't know where she is, Edward," Jazelle said, her voice quiet but firm. "You have no idea where she went. And even if you did, What do you think you're going to do? Beg her to come back? She's done with us. The word stung, but Jazelle wasn't wrong. They had both taken Barbara for granted, assuming she would always be there to support them, to bail them out of trouble. But now, in an instant, they were facing the consequences of their neglect. They had nothing without her. Call the lawyer. Call anyone, Edward snapped, his voice growing more frantic. We can't lose this house. I can't go back to the life I had before. But as his words trailed off, the reality of the situation settled in like a weight on his chest. They were in debt. The mortgage was overdue. The car payments were late. The private school tuition for the kids was about to bounce. The security they had built around their lives was gone. We need to figure this out, Jazelle said again, her tone calmer now but no less urgent. We need to talk to the bank, find a way to access the accounts again. We can't do this on our own. Edward's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He dialed the number for their financial advisor, but the call didn't go through. He cursed under his breath and slammed the phone down. The sense of powerlessness was suffocating. Barbara had taken everything, and now they were left to pick up the pieces of a life built on the assumption that someone else would always be there to take care of them. The house, the car, the vacations, they had all been built on a foundation of Barbara's sacrifices. Now, that foundation had cracked, and everything was crumbling. And Edward was realizing, too late, that he had underestimated the woman who had always been there, quietly holding everything together. Now she had walked away, and he was left to face the consequences of his own arrogance. Barbara stood in the quiet of the basement room, the suitcase by the door, already packed with only the essentials. There was no need for anything else. She had spent her life accumulating things, clothes, furniture, jewelry, but none of it seemed important now. What she was taking with her wasn't material. It was something deeper, something she had lost along the way, and something she was finally reclaiming. She carefully folded the clothes she had gathered into the suitcase, each item a quiet act of finality. A t-shirt she had worn when she used to cook dinner for Edward, a cardigan she had knit herself years ago, a pair of shoes that had seen too many hospital shifts to count. These were the things she needed, the things that defined her, not by their value, but by the life she had lived. The house above her, once a symbol of family and belonging, now felt empty and distant. It was a house that had held too many dreams that had never been realized, too many sacrifices that had gone unrecognized. Now it was just a place, a collection of walls and rooms, waiting to be filled by the next chapter of someone else's life. Barbara took a deep breath, steadying herself. There was no turning back now. The decision was final. She was done being a guest in her own life, done with the years of feeling invisible, the quiet humiliation, and the constant expectation that she would give, without ever being seen, without ever being appreciated. Her fingers brushed across the letter she had written earlier, the words bold and final. She picked it up from the desk, her handwriting firm and clear. It was her goodbye, her reckoning. She placed the letter on the kitchen table, knowing Edward would find it. It was the only way she could leave, the only way she could make him see the consequences of his actions. The words on the page were simple, yet they held the weight of everything she had endured. Edward, you threw water in my face because I asked for a piece of bread. You thought I was asking for too much. Well, I wasn't, and now I'm taking back what's mine. You don't want to share a piece of bread? Fine, I'll take back the whole bakery. Barbara paused for a moment after reading the letter one last time. There was no bitterness in her words, no anger, only a sense of finality. She had given him everything. Her love, her sacrifices, her time. And now she was walking away from it all. From him, from the house, from the life she had built for him and Jazelle. She took a deep breath and placed the letter down, making sure it was visible. There would be no mistaking it. She wasn't just leaving the house. She was leaving the role she had played for far too long. The role of the silent, patient, ever-giving mother who never asked for anything in return. She had stopped asking a long time ago. Now she was taking back her life. Her fingers gently zipped up the suitcase, and she glanced around the room one last time. It was empty, save for the faint echoes of the past that no longer defined her, the past that was now behind her, Barbara walked toward the door. The steps felt heavier now, but with each one she felt a growing sense of lightness. She wasn't burdened by the weight of sacrifice anymore. She was free. She had chosen herself for the first time in years. The front door creaked open as she stepped out of the house, the sun shining down on her as she made her way down the path. The house stood behind her, silent and still, as though it too understood the magnitude of what had just happened. Barbara didn't look back. There was no need to. What she was walking away from no longer mattered. What she was walking toward, however, was everything. The future, her future, a life she could build for herself, without guilt, without the weight of unappreciated sacrifices, without the shadows of Edward's indifference. As she closed the gate behind her, Barbara took one last look at the life she was leaving behind, and with that, she stepped forward, toward her own freedom. Barbara made a bold choice to reclaim her life. What about you? Have you ever had to walk away from something or someone to find your own freedom? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever fought for your independence. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, but neither Edward nor Jazelle was prepared for what was about to hit them. It had been a few days since Barbara left, and in that time the house had remained eerily silent. Edward had hoped that maybe Barbara would come back, that she was just sulking, that her departure was just a temporary reaction to the water-throwing incident. But when he opened the letter on the kitchen table, the truth settled in like a heavy stone. It wasn't just a departure, it was a finality. She had left, and she had taken everything with her. The funds, the assets, the control over their finances, it was all gone. Edward, what's this? Jazelle's voice was sharp with disbelief. She stood in the doorway, holding her phone in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. Edward's heart began to race as he looked at the letter Barbara had left behind, her words cutting through him like a knife. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. She had taken back control. Not only had she moved her money, but she had also severed their access to it completely. The bank account was frozen. The investments, they were no longer theirs. Jazelle dropped the papers in shock, and Edward's hands shook as he reached for his phone. He tried to dial the bank, but his call went straight to voicemail. His stomach twisted in knots as he realized the extent of the damage. Without Barbara's financial contributions, they were on the verge of losing everything: the house, the car, the lifestyle they had so easily taken for granted. How could she do this to us? Jazelle said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. How could she just leave us like this? Edward's mind raced, 100 thoughts swirling through his head. How had he not seen it? How had he not realized that Barbara was the one who had kept everything together all these years? He had taken her for granted, assuming she would always be there to bail him out when things got tough. But now, with everything slipping through his fingers, he understood the true cost of his arrogance. His eyes dropped to the papers on the table, the ones Jazelle had dropped in her panic. He didn't need to look at them again to know what they meant: the bills, the overdue payments, the notices of impending foreclosure on the house. The very foundation of their lives had been built on Barbara's sacrifices, but Edward hadn't even known it. The lifestyle they had built, the expensive dinners, the vacations, the lavish lifestyle, had all been paid for with Barbara's selflessness. And now, without her financial cushion, the reality of their situation was beginning to hit them both. Edward, we need to fix this. Jazelle's voice cracked as she moved closer to him. We need to get the money back. We can't lose everything. Edward didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. The weight of his mistakes pressed down on him like a vice. He had been so focused on himself, on his own success, that he had failed to see how much his mother had given up for him. The things he had taken for granted, his comfort, his security, had all been provided by Barbara's sacrifices. And now, she was gone, and he was left to face the consequences of his neglect. The realization came slowly, but it was undeniable. He had mistreated the one person who had always been there for him. He had belittled her, taken advantage of her, and in doing so, he had lost everything. As Edward sank down into the chair, his mind spinning, he felt a wave of guilt wash over him. All the years he had taken Barbara's love and sacrifices for granted had led to this moment, the fall from grace. And now he had to face the harsh truth. He had no one to blame but himself. Jazelle stood beside him, her face pale and drawn. She was trying to remain calm, but even she couldn't hide the panic in her eyes. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Edward closed his eyes, his hands gripping the edges of the table as if holding on to some semblance of control. "I don't know," he muttered. "I don't know." The house, which had once felt like a symbol of their success, now felt like a prison. It was too big, too empty, a reminder of everything they had lost. The rooms that had been filled with laughter and clinking glasses were now silent, echoing with the weight of their mistakes. As the reality of their situation began to sink in, Edward felt the full force of Barbara's departure. She had been the one who held everything together, the one who had supported them even when they didn't deserve it. And now she was gone. For the first time, Edward understood the depth of her sacrifice. She had given everything for him, for their family, without ever asking for anything in return. But he had never truly seen it until now. As the days passed and the bills piled up, the house continued to unravel. Edward and Jazelle tried to salvage what was left, calling the bank, speaking to lawyers, doing everything they could to keep up appearances. But deep down, they both knew the truth. They had lost everything that mattered, and they had no one to blame but themselves. Barbara sat on the balcony of her new apartment in Sarasota, the soft scent of salt water drifting up from the Gulf. The morning sun cast a golden light across the ocean, and the gentle breeze rustled the palm trees just outside. She took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to truly relax. It was a far cry from the cold, sterile house she had left behind in Naperville. That house, once filled with dreams and expectations, now seemed like a distant memory, a place she had outgrown, a life she no longer needed. The emptiness that had consumed her there had faded into something beautiful here. Space, freedom, and most importantly, peace. Barbara had spent the first few days after her move simply basking in the stillness. There was no one to judge her, no one to belittle her or make her feel small. The noise of constant demands had quieted. In its place was a life of her own making. She had made the decision to leave, and now, with every passing day, she felt herself healing, reclaiming the parts of herself that had been buried under years of sacrifice. Sarasota was different. It wasn't just the warm weather or the scenic views that made it feel like home. It was the freedom to breathe without feeling like she was walking on eggshells, the freedom to be herself without having to explain, to defend, or to apologize for wanting something as simple as a peaceful dinner or a quiet afternoon. The apartment was small, but it was hers. It had a modest charm, a cozy, sun-filled living room, a compact kitchen where she could finally cook the meals she loved, and a small bedroom with a window that let in just enough light to make the mornings feel hopeful. She had found a sense of belonging here that she had never felt in her own home, the place she had once shared with Edward and Jazelle. Barbara spent her mornings by the beach, walking along the shore with the waves lapping at her feet. The rhythm of the ocean was soothing, and it reminded her of the calm that had always been inside her, buried under the years of putting others first. For the first time, she didn't feel guilty for taking time for herself. She didn't have to justify her choices. She didn't have to apologize for choosing happiness. Her life here wasn't perfect. Nothing was. But it was real. It was hers. And that was enough. There were no more fake smiles or hollow gestures. No more pretending to be grateful for a life that had drained her. She had walked away from the toxicity, and now she was rebuilding. Slowly but surely, the pieces of her self-worth were coming together again. Barbara looked out at the horizon, watching as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the water. She smiled to herself, a quiet smile of satisfaction. She had done it. She had walked away from everything, and now she was finally free. Free from Edward's control, free from the manipulation, free from the years of sacrifice that had left her feeling small and insignificant. She had found her voice, and with it, her power. It wasn't easy to leave. It wasn't easy to say goodbye to a life she had built around love and sacrifice. But in walking away, Barbara had discovered a truth she had always known deep down. Reclaiming your dignity is not about revenge or anger. It's about choosing yourself. It's about recognizing your worth, even when others can't or won't. It's about the quiet strength it takes to walk away from a life that no longer serves you, and finding the courage to step into the unknown, to rebuild, and to embrace a new beginning. As Barbara took one last look at the setting sun, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had no regrets. She had made the right choice. She had chosen herself. Barbara's emotional journey had come full circle. The woman who had once been a silent giver, a mother who gave everything for her family, had rediscovered her strength. She had reclaimed her life, and now, with the horizon before her, she was ready to embrace whatever came next. Barbara's journey reminds us all of the power of reclaiming our dignity and finding the courage to walk away from toxic relationships. Have you ever had to make a tough decision to put yourself first? Share your story in the comments below, and if you're ready to value yourself, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of strength and transformation.